The relentless summer sun blazed over the peaceful sagebrush valley of Arizona Territory, but the dark stains seeping into the wooden floorboards of McPherson's general store told a different story. 3 men, their counterfeit badges glinting. In the harsh desert light, cornered young Daniel Reed behind his own counter, their leader's revolver pressed against the shopkeeper's trembling temple. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. One more time, boy, drawled the tallest of the 3, his voice dripping with false sweetness. Where's that farmer's whelp who's been tending old Morrison's place, the one they call Samuel? The bandit's breath carried the sour stench of tobacco and cheap whiskey. Daniel's eyes darted to the door, wishing he'd never mentioned the quiet young man who'd been buying extra ammunition lately. I don't know much about him, Mr. Blackwood, just that he helps his pa with the crops. Nothing special about him. Blackwood's laugh was sharp as a rattler's warning. Nothing special? That nothing special farmer's boy put 3 of my best men in the ground last week, didn't leave a single trace either. Now what kind of simple farmhand, can do something like that? Before Daniel could stammer a response, the store's bell chimed softly. A young man shuffled in, barely 20 by the look of him, shoulders stooped from long hours in the fields. Samuel Morrison, the very man they'd been discussing, seemed almost fragile in his patched overalls and mud-caked boots. Blackwood's men tensed, hands hovering over their guns, but their leader waved them down with a smirk. What threat could this dirt-poor farmer's son pose? The Morrison farm sat like an emerald jewel in the valley's rough palm, a testament to 5 years of back-breaking work. Samuel had helped his father choose this spot, though they told folks it was for the fertile soil and reliable water source. The modest farmhouse, built from local pine and adobe, watched over neat rows of corn and wheat, while a collection of well-maintained barns and corrals completed the picture of honest industry. Everything about it spoke of simple farming life, right down to the carefully placed scarecrows that kept watch in every direction. Inside the farmhouse, Samuel moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd spent too many hours behind a plough, setting his morning coffee to boil while his younger sister Grace kneaded bread dough at the kitchen table. At 16, she had their late mother's golden hair and a spirit as untamed as the wild horses that sometimes passed through their valley. They'd found each other 3 years ago when Samuel discovered her hiding in their barn, half-starved and fleeing from horrors neither of them discussed. "You're thinking mighty hard for someone just making coffee," Grace observed, flour dusting. Her forearms, her keen eyes, sharp as any hunter's, missed little about the brother who'd given her a home. Samuel allowed himself a small smile that barely touched the corners of his mouth. "Just wondering if we'll get enough rain for the corn this season." He didn't mention his trip to town or the men he'd spotted watching their property last week. No need to worry her with such things. Grace wiped her hands on her apron, leaving white handprints that matched the ones on her cheeks. "Speaking of the harvest, Michael Taylor rode by yesterday while you were checking the north field. Says his father's willing to pay top dollar for some of our corn come autumn." Samuel's hands stilled momentarily on the coffee pot. Michael Taylor. He'd been seeing a lot of that boy lately. His voice carried a weight Grace couldn't quite understand. "He's nice, Samuel, not like those Blackwood boys who keep stirring up trouble." Grace's defense came quickly, but her eyes dropped to the dough. "Besides, he's been teaching me to shoot." The coffee pot clattered against the stove harder than necessary. "Shooting? Since when do you need shooting lessons?" "Since always." Grace's chin lifted stubbornly. "You won't teach me proper, just basic safety rules. Michael says a girl ought to know how to defend herself out here." Samuel felt the familiar ache in his right shoulder where an old bullet had left its mark. "Basic rules keep people alive, Grace. Anything more than that tends to attract the wrong kind of attention." He'd spent years cultivating this image of a simple farmer's son, Someone who could barely hit a barn door with a shotgun, the kind of man who'd need help from young Michael Taylor to defend his property. Their morning routine continued, each movement a carefully choreographed dance around the truth. Samuel fed the chickens, his movements deliberately clumsy, when Grace watched from the kitchen window. He checked the cornfields with exaggerated weariness, making sure the farmhands they'd hired saw nothing but a young man struggling with the demanding work of running a farm. But in the barn, alone with the horses, Samuel's movements shifted. His hands, steady as mountain stone, cleaned and oiled a hidden Colt Walker revolver with practiced precision. The weapon's grip bore no initials, but the number of notches along its barrel told stories he'd spent years trying to forget. The farmhands whispered sometimes about the strange luck of the Morrison farm, how their crops never got raided despite the troubles other farms faced, how rustlers mysteriously avoided their cattle, how their young boss seemed to know about trouble coming before it arrived. "Must be the Lord's blessing," Samuel would say, his voice trembling just enough. "He watches over fools and farmers alike." But the Lord had nothing to do with the carefully placed mirrors in the barn cupola that allowed him to watch the valley approaches, or the cached weapons hidden throughout the property, each cleaned weekly when the hands were away, or the fact that Samuel knew every ridge, cave, and hollow within 10 miles of his land. When folks asked why he and his father had chosen this particular plot, he'd spin tales about soil quality and water rights. He never mentioned how the terrain offered perfect firing positions, or how the creek's bend created a natural barrier against surprise attacks. Some knowledge was better left unspoken, some skills better left forgotten. That morning, as Samuel watched Grace practice her roping in the corral, Michael Taylor rode up on his Kiesnut Mare. The boy's smile carried no threat, his wave friendly as summer sunshine, but Samuel noticed how the young man's gun belt rode low, how his right hand never strayed far from its grip. Little tells that spoke volumes to those who knew how to rid them. "Morning, Samuel," Michael called out, all politeness and charm. "Thought we might discuss that corn trade my pa mentioned." Samuel nodded, maintaining his careful shuffle as he moved toward the corral fence. "Sure, Michael. Grace, why don't you fetch our guest some coffee?" As his sister hurried inside, Samuel studied Michael Taylor with eyes that had once tracked men across 3 territories. The boy's father, Thomas Taylor, had been asking a lot of questions lately about water rights, about cattle trails, about the strange sounds some claimed to hear from the Morrison farm at night. "Your pa still planning that big cattle drive come autumn?" Samuel asked, his voice quavering just enough. Michael leaned against the fence, trying to look casual, but betraying his tension in a dozen tiny ways. "Yes, sir. Hoping to take the herd clear to New Mexico this year." Samuel nodded, calculating distances and timing in his head. New Mexico meant the Blood Rock Pass, meant narrow canyons and blind corners, meant perfect places for an ambush if someone was of such a mind. The coffee would give them time to talk, time for Samuel to assess whether Michael Taylor was truly sweet on his sister or playing a deeper game, time to decide if the boy's questions were innocent or if, like so many others, before him he'd somehow caught the scent of a past that refused to stay buried. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains. Samuel's shoulder ached with the coming weather, the old bullet singing its familiar song of violence and regret. Change was coming to Sagebrush Valley, carrying with it echoes of a life he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Samuel's eyes caught movement in the tree line where their property met Hawkins Creek. Most would have missed it, but he'd spent too many years watching for the subtle signs that meant trouble. Someone was using the cover of the cottonwoods to observe the farm, and they were skilled enough to stay mostly hidden. "More coffee?" Grace's voice pulled him back to the present as she returned with a steaming pot. Michael accepted his cup with a grateful nod, but Samuel noticed how the young man's eyes kept drifting to the north pasture, where the farm's boundaries weren't clearly marked. "That sister of yours sure has a way with baking," Michael commented, gesturing to the fresh bread Grace had brought out. Ma says she's never tasted better sourdough in all of Arizona. Samuel watched Grace beam at the compliment, his heart heavy with the weight of secrets. Their mother had indeed been known for her baking, but not in Arizona. That had been in another life, before a gang of ruthless killers had destroyed their family's small Kansas homestead, before Samuel had discovered his true calling in the aftermath of that bloody night. The farmhands were gathering for their midday meal, filing into the bunkhouse where old Joseph, their cook, would have beans and cornbread waiting. Samuel had chosen each worker carefully over the years, not just for their farming skills, but for other, less obvious qualities. Like Thomas, the quiet man from Texas, who seemed simple, but whose eyes never missed a detail. Or Maria, who cleaned the main house and somehow always knew when strangers passed through the valley. "Might rain tonight," Michael observed, squinting at the gathering clouds. "Good for the corn, I expect." Samuel nodded, allowing a slight tremor in his hands as he set down his coffee cup. "Lord willing, though rain brings other troubles too, makes it hard to hear what's coming in the night." Michael's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Heard tell of some strange business over Copper Creek last week. 3 men found dead, no signs of struggle. The sheriffs might be puzzled about it." "That's so." Samuel kept his voice neutral, though his mind flashed to the confrontation that had left 3 of Blackwood's men feeding the vultures. They'd been planning to raid the Watson widow's farm, and he couldn't let that happen. Not after promising her late husband he'd keep an eye on the place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Grace, who'd been listening intently, spoke up. "Samuel, didn't you say you were over by Copper Creek last Tuesday, checking on that broken fence?" Before Samuel could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was approaching fast, kicking up dust along the main road. Even at this distance, Samuel recognized the nervous energy of Daniel Reed's paint horse. "Something's wrong," he muttered, dropping the farmer's son's act for just a moment. Michael caught the change, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, but Samuel was already shuffling toward the house in his carefully maintained persona of rural innocence. "Grace, go inside," he called out, his voice pitched to carry just the right amount of concern. "Michael, might be best if you—" "Samuel!" Daniel's shortcut through the afternoon air as he reined his horse to a stop. "They're coming. Blackwood and his men. They're—" The young shopkeeper's words dissolved into coughing from the dusty ride. Samuel's mind raced through scenarios and options, each practiced and prepared for during countless sleepless nights. The hidden rifles in the barn, the ammunition cached beneath the floorboards, the escape routes he'd carefully maintained. All while pretending to be nothing more than a simple farmer's son, trying to help his father's dream succeed. "How many?" he asked quietly, still maintaining his facade of nervous uncertainty. 8, maybe 10, Daniel gasped. "Blackwood's got it in his head that you know something about his men going missing. He's coming to torch the— Varm says he'll make an example." "Grace," Samuel cut in, his voice still carrying its cultivated tremor, "get Pa's old shotgun from above the fireplace, then take Daniel to the root cellar." His sister started to protest, but he silenced her with a look that bypassed her teenage rebellion and went straight to her survival instinct. Michael Taylor stood uncertainly by the corral, clearly torn between staying to help and riding for assistance. "Samuel, my pa's got men who could—" "No time," Samuel interrupted, shuffling toward the barn with exaggerated anxiety. "Best to ride home, Michael. No sense in you getting caught up in this." But as he reached the barn door, Samuel allowed himself an unguarded moment, one glimpse of the man he truly was, the legendary shadow shooter who'd hunted down the Kansas kill gang one by one, the ghost that even hardened outlaws spoke of in whispers. His eyes met Michael's, and the young man took an involuntary step back, suddenly unsure of everything he thought he knew about the farmer's son. Blackwood and his gang took their time approaching the Morrison farm, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that mingled with the threatening storm clouds above. In the barn, Samuel's hands moved with practiced efficiency, no longer maintaining the charade of farmerly clumsiness. He'd positioned Grace and Daniel in the root cellar, accessible, through a hidden trapdoor beneath the barn's false floor. His sister had argued, of course, but some tones of voice bypassed the argument and went straight to obedience. Through the carefully placed mirrors in the cupola, he counted 8 riders, with 2 more likely hidden in the tree line near Hawkins Creek, more than he'd expected, but not more than he'd prepared for. Behind him, Michael Taylor cleared his throat nervously. "You should have gone home, Michael," Samuel said quietly, his voice now carrying none of its usual uncertainty. "What you're about to see, it'll change things." "Already changed," Michael replied, checking his revolver with shaking hands. "Never seen a man go from frightened farmer to whatever you are in the blink of an eye." Samuel allowed himself a grim smile as he retrieved a well-oiled Winchester from its hiding place. "What I am is what circumstances made me. Just like these circumstances are about to make you decide what kind of man you want to be." Old Joseph appeared at the barn's side door, shotgun cradled in weathered hands. The cook's eyes held none of their usual gentle humor. "Thomas has the south position covered. Maria's got the hands moving the horses to safety. You were right about keeping extra weapons cached around the property." Samuel nodded, unsurprised that his carefully selected farm hands were revealing their true capabilities. "Blackwood's going to try to draw us out, make a show of it. Men like that, reputation's everything." "Samuel Morrison," Blackwood's voice boomed across the yard right on cue. "Come on out, boy. Let's talk about those dead men over Copper Creek." Samuel moved to the barn's front doors, staying in shadow. Through the gaps in the weathered wood, he could see Blackwood sitting tall in his saddle, that false badge gleaming. The gang leader's reputation for cruelty was well earned, but like many cruel men, he had a weakness for theatrical displays. "Mr. Blackwood," Samuel called back, carefully maintaining a tremor in his voice one last time. "There must be some mistake. I'm just a farmer's son, sir, trying to help my pa's dream succeed." Blackwood's laugh carried across the yard. "Farmer's son? What did you tell the Kansas Kill Gang before you picked them off one by one? What did you whisper to Mad Dog Matthews before you left him face down in the Missouri mud?" Michael's sharp intake of breath spoke volumes. Everyone in the territories had heard of the shadow shooter, the ghost-like gunman who'd hunted down the Kansas Kill Gang after they'd murdered a homesteading family. The details were sketchy, but stories said he'd tracked them across 5 states, using their own brutal tactics against them. "The boy you're looking for died in Kansas," Samuel replied, his voice dropping its pretense entirely. "Along with his mother, father, and little sister. What rose from those ashes? Well, that's something else entirely." Thunder rolled overhead as Samuel turned to Michael. "Last chance to walk away, son. What's about to happen here? There's no going back from it." But Michael Taylor squared his shoulders, fear warring with determination in his young face. "Grace is sweet to me, and I am to her. Way I see it, that makes this my fight, too." "Touching," Blackwood's voice dripped with mockery. "The farmer's son found himself a family, built himself a nice little life out here in the middle of nowhere. Be a shame if something happened to it all." Samuel's mind raced through the possibilities. Blackwood wasn't just here for revenge over his dead men. The gang leader's theatrical approach, his mention of the Kansas Kill Gang. He was trying to provoke a specific response. "Joseph," Samuel spoke quietly, "when did you first realize who I was?" The old cook checked his shotgun shells with practiced ease. "About 2 months after you hired me. Way you moved when you thought no one was watching reminded me of another young man I knew once, down Texas way. Man who'd learned to kill before he learned to live. And you stayed anyway? Joseph's weathered face creased in a small smile. Everyone deserves a second chance at living, long as they're willing to earn it. Besides, your pa, he's a good man, building something real here. Samuel's father was away in Prescott, selling their early wheat harvest. The timing of Blackwood's attack wasn't coincidental. Nothing about this situation was. Speaking of your pa, Blackwood called out, clearly enjoying his role. Man of God like that, raising a killer, must be quite a burden on his conscience. Wonder what he'd say if he knew what his boy really was. He knows. Samuel's quiet words carried clearly. In the storm-heavy air. Known since the day he found me half dead in that Kansas creek, blood on my hands and vengeance in my heart. Didn't try to stop me hunting down my family's killers. Just made me promise that when it was done, I'd learn to live again. A flash of lightning illuminated the yard, and in that brilliant moment, Samuel caught sight of movement in his peripheral vision. 2 riders trying to work their way behind the barn, just as he'd predicted. Thomas would be waiting for them. Noble sentiment, Blackwood sneered. But you didn't learn to live, did you? Just learned to hide, playing farmer, pretending at peace, all while keeping your skills sharp. How many men have disappeared in this valley since you arrived? How many bodies are hidden in shallow graves? Only the ones who needed killing, Samuel replied coldly. Men who prey on widows and orphans, men who wear false badges and call it authority. Men like you, Blackwood. The gang leader's face darkened. You sound awfully sure of yourself for a man outnumbered 10-1. 8-1, Samuel corrected, as 2 shots rang out from the south corner of the property. Thomas's marksmanship was as precise as his dossier had suggested, and dropping, Blackwood's calm facade cracked slightly. "Kill them all!" he roared, spurring his horse forward as his men opened fire, the air filled with gun smoke and thunder. As the battle erupted, Samuel's Winchester spoke with deadly precision, dropping 1 rider before the rest could find cover. Joseph's shotgun roared from the side door, while Maria's rifle cracked from somewhere near the house. Michael, to his credit, held his position, though his shots went wide. "Sweet Jesus," the young man whispered. "You're him. You're really him." "The shadow shooter was him," Samuel corrected, dropping another of Blackwood's men as the gang tried to maneuver around the barn. "Now I'm just a farmer's son trying to protect his home." But even as he said it, Samuel felt the old instincts taking over. The world seemed to slow down, each movement, each sound crystal clear in his heightened awareness. This wasn't the methodical hunting he'd done as the shadow shooter, tracking prey across states and territories. This was close-quarters combat, the kind he'd learned in the bitter aftermath of his family's murder. Through the carefully placed mirrors, he tracked Blackwood's remaining men as they tried to encircle the barn. The gang leader himself had fallen back, letting his expendable riders test the farm's defenses. Smart, but not smart enough. "Your pa," Michael spoke up between shots. "He really knew about what you were? What have you done?" Samuel's Winchester dropped another rider trying to reach the house. "Knew before he took me in. Said sometimes the Lord works through unlikely instruments. Said maybe all that death could lead to something better if I was willing to try." A scream from the south corner told him Thomas had claimed another victim. The old ranger hadn't lost his touch, despite years of pretending to be a simple farmhand. "The real question," Samuel continued, "is what you're going to do with what you know. Assuming we survive the next few minutes." Michael's response was cut short as the barn's roof erupted in flames. One of Blackwood's men had managed to get close enough to throw a torch. The dry summer wood caught quickly, and smoke began filling. "The interior. Time to move," Samuel announced, slinging the Winchester over his shoulder. "Remember what I taught you about the root cellar tunnel, Joseph?" The old cook nodded. "Leads all the way to the creek bed. Grace and Daniel should be halfway there by now, assuming she followed instructions. When has Grace ever followed instructions? Samuel allowed himself a small smile. Michael, go with Joseph. Get to the creek, stay low, and... No. The young man's voice carried unexpected steel. Grace is family to you. Way I see it, that makes you family to me. I'm staying. Before Samuel could argue, more shots rang out from the direction of the house. Maria's voice carried clearly through the chaos. Riders coming! From the east! Samuel's heart sank. Reinforcements for Blackwood, most likely. The gang leader had planned this too well, waited too long to spring his trap. But as he peered through the smoke, Samuel saw something that made him pause. The approaching riders weren't the rough-looking desperados typical of Blackwood's gang. They were well-mounted, well-armed, and they rode with the disciplined formation he recognized from his own past. Leading them was Thomas Taylor, Michael's father, and beside him rode a tall man whose silver star wasn't false at all. The real marshal had arrived, and with him came a reckoning 2 years in the making. Through the smoke and chaos, Samuel caught Blackwood's expression shift from confidence to barely concealed panic. The gang leader clearly hadn't expected this complication. "Hold your ground!" Blackwood shouted to his remaining men, but uncertainty had already crept into their ranks. "That's far enough, Blackwood." Marshal Hayes's voice boomed across the yard with the authority of genuine law. "We've got your confession from Silver Junction. We know about the real badges you stole, about the deputies you murdered. It's over, Samuel." Used the distraction to motion Joseph and Michael toward the house. "Get to Grace," he whispered. "If Blackwood's men make it past us, she'll need protection." The old cook nodded, guiding the younger man through the smoke, but Grace, true to form, hadn't stayed in the root cellar. Samuel caught a glimpse of her at an upstairs window, his father's old Sharps rifle steady in her hands. Despite everything, he felt a surge of pride. She'd learned more than just basic safety rules, watching him when she thought he wasn't aware. Blackwood's laugh carried a desperate edge. "You're bluffing, Hayes! Ain't no witnesses left alive in Silver Junction." "What, do you think?" Thomas Taylor rode forward, his usual merchant's demeanor replaced by something harder. "My trade caravans go everywhere, Blackwood. See everything, learn everything. Been gathering evidence against you for 2 years now." Samuel's mind raced, pieces falling into place. Michael's courtship of Grace, the Taylor family's constant questions about valley traffic. They'd been building a case all along. His carefully maintained cover hadn't fooled them. They'd been using it, just as he'd been using their presence, to monitor potential threats. A shot rang out as one of Blackwood's men panicked, firing at the marshal's posse. The valley erupted into chaos once more, but this time the odds had shifted dramatically. Caught between Samuel's defensive positions and Hayes's approaching forces, Blackwood's gang began to break. "Samuel!" Grace's voice carried from the house. "Riders in the tree line! They're trying to flank the marshal." He'd been waiting for this. Blackwood always kept a reserve force hidden, ready to strike when attention was focused elsewhere. But Samuel hadn't spent 5 years building this farm without preparing for every contingency. "Maria," he called out, "light it up." The Mexican woman struck a match, touching it to a carefully prepared fuse. Moments later, a series of explosions rocked the tree line. Not enough to kill, but the pre-positioned charges sent horses rearing, and riders scrambling for cover, disrupting their planned ambush. "Sweet Lord," Michael breathed, still nearby despite Samuel's orders to retreat. "You rigged the whole valley." "Just the likely attack routes," Samuel replied, dropping another of Blackwood's men as the gang tried to regroup. "Been expecting something like this since we first settled here, though I thought it'd be the Kansas Kill Gang's remnants, not a corrupt badge hunter." Thunder cracked overhead as the storm finally broke. Rain began falling in sheets, turning the yard into a muddy battlefield. Through the downpour, Samuel saw Blackwood wheeling his horse around, preparing to flee. "He's running!" Marshal Hayes shouted. "Don't let him escape. He's our link to the whole corrupt badge operation." But Samuel had already moved. In one fluid motion, he dropped the Winchester and drew a Colt Walker revolver from beneath his coat. The weapon seemed to materialize in his hand like a deadly magic trick. Time slowed as he took aim. The rain, the shouts, the gunfire, all faded away. At that moment, he wasn't Samuel Morrison, the farmer's son. He was the shadow shooter again, the wraith that had hunted down 19 men across 5 states after the Kansas massacre. The Colt roared once, its heavy bullet striking. Blackwood's saddle horn. The gang leader pitched forward as his horse reared, tumbling into the mud. Before he could recover, Samuel's second shot destroyed his gun hand, ending the threat permanently. As Marshal Hayes' men moved to secure the surviving gang members, Thomas Taylor approached the barn, keeping his hands clearly visible. "Been wondering how long you'd keep up the act, Mr. Morrison, or should I say McAllister? That was your name back in Kansas, wasn't it?" Samuel lowered the Colt slowly. "That name died with my family. Samuel Morrison is who I am now, who I choose to be." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Choice is a powerful thing. My boy chose to court your sister honestly, even after he figured out who you were, choosing family over duty. Can't say I blame him." The rain began to slacken as Grace emerged from the house, running to embrace Michael despite the mud and danger. Marshal Hayes dismounted, approaching with the careful respect one deadly man shows another. "The shadow shooter," Hayes said quietly. "Thought you died after bringing down the last of the Kansas kill gang." "Did die, in a way," Samuel replied, watching as his farmhands, his real family, emerged from their defensive positions. Found something worth living for instead. The marshal studied the farm's clever defenses, the precisely placed firing positions, and the evidence of long preparation. "Territory could use men like you, Morrison. Men who understand that sometimes justice needs a shadow to work in." "But," Samuel was already shaking his head, "my pa taught me that a man can't serve 2 masters, can't be both shadow and light. Made my choice when I put down roots here. Even if it means letting men like Blackwood prey on honest folks." Samuel's smile was cold. "Never said I wouldn't help. Just won't wear a badge to do it. Some justice works better when it's unofficial." The storm was passing now, sunlight breaking through the clouds. Samuel looked at the family he'd built, Grace and Michael, their young love stronger for having faced fire together. Joseph, Thomas and Maria, who'd chosen to stay even after learning his true nature. The farm itself, built not just as a home, but as a fortress for protecting what mattered. "My father," he said finally, "the man who found me in that creek and gave me a new name, a new purpose. He'd say this was all part of God's plan, that sometimes the Lord needs both shepherds and sheepdogs to protect the flock." "And which are you?" Hayes asked. Samuel watched as Grace helped Michael tend to his minor wounds, saw the way his farm hands moved with the easy confidence of people who knew their true worth. "Neither. Just a farmer's son, protecting what's his." But his hand never strayed far from the Colt, and his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. Some instincts couldn't be unlearned, some skills couldn't be forgotten. The shadow shooter might have died in Kansas, but his ghost lived on in every careful preparation, every hidden weapon, every lesson taught to those he loved. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest justice of all. The aftermath of the battle revealed more than just spent cartridges in the mud. As Marshal Hayes's deputies led away the surviving members of Blackwood's gang, Samuel discovered something that made his blood run cold. Hidden in Blackwood's saddlebags was a carefully detailed map of the Morrison farm, showing every building, every defensive position, even the hidden root cellar entrance. The level of detail suggested inside knowledge. "Someone's been watching us," he muttered, showing the map to Thomas Taylor. "For months, maybe longer." The merchant studied the document with a practiced eye. Not just watching. These marks here, snow patrol patterns, guard rotations. Whoever drew this knew your operation inside and out. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities. Every hand he'd hired had been carefully vetted, their backgrounds thoroughly checked. He'd learned that lesson the hard way back in his shadow shooter. Days, when trust given too freely had nearly cost him his life. Grace approached, her father's Sharps rifle still held with comfortable familiarity. Samuel, Daniel's gone, root cellar empty, and his horse is missing. A cold certainty settled in Samuel's gut. Daniel Reed, the seemingly timid shopkeeper who'd warned them of Blackwood's approach, who'd known exactly when to arrive with news of the impending attack. "It was a setup," Michael said quietly, reading Samuel's expression. "He wanted us concentrated here, defending against Blackwood, while what?" Before Samuel could respond, Maria's voice carried from the north barn. "Patron, come quickly! They found the Mexican woman standing before a false wall Samuel himself hadn't known existed. The recent firefight had damaged the barn's structure, revealing a hidden room behind the carefully stacked hay bales. Inside, they discovered enough weapons and ammunition to arm a small army. "These aren't yours?" Marshal Hayes asked, examining. "A crate of new Winchester rifles." Samuel shook his head slowly. "Someone's been using my land, my reputation, as cover for something bigger." His eyes met Thomas Taylor's. "That's why you were really watching us, wasn't it? Not just because of Blackwood?" The merchant nodded grimly. "Started as a standard investigation into Blackwood's badge corruption, but we kept finding connections to something larger. Weapons disappearing from military shipments, showing up in the hands of raiders across 3 territories. Someone's been building an army." "Daniel Reed," Grace said suddenly. "He always knew when military convoys were passing through. Said he heard it from the stage drivers, but he was part of it all along," Samuel finished. "Using the general store as a front, just like—" He stopped. Memories of Kansas suddenly sharp as broken glass. "Just like what?" Michael asked. "Just like the Kansas kill gang did. They had a store, too, right on the main road through town. Perfect place to gather intelligence, monitor traffic, and plan their raids." Samuel's voice carried the weight of, "Old Payne, I should have seen it, should have recognized the pattern." Marshal Hayes studied the weapons cache thoughtfully. "This goes beyond simple banditry. These are new army repeaters, not even issued to regular troops yet. Someone with serious connections is behind this." A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. One of Hayes's deputies led in a mud-covered figure they'd found hiding in the creek bed. Samuel recognized him as one of the regular customers at Reed's store, a quiet man who'd always paid too much attention to passing traffic. "Talk," Hayes commanded, but the man just smiled, revealing a gap where his front teeth should have been. Samuel stepped forward, letting the shadow of his past self show through. "I remember you," he said softly. "You were there in Kansas. Different name, different face, but those eyes. You were with them the night they killed my family." The man's smile faltered slightly. "You're supposed to be dead. They said the boy died with the others." "The boy did die," Samuel replied, his voice carrying echoes of the shadow shooter's cold precision. "What rose from those ashes? Well, you've heard the stories." Fear finally crept into the man's expression. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. The Kansas job was just the beginning. We've spent years building this, placing our people, gathering resources. You can't stop what's coming." "What is coming?" Hayes demanded. But Samuel already knew. The pieces were falling into place, a pattern he should have recognized sooner. "They're not building an army," he said quietly. "They're building an empire, using men like Blackwood to eliminate honest lawmen, replacing them with corrupt badgers, staging raids to drive out small ranchers and farmers, consolidating territory under their control." Thomas Taylor nodded slowly. "That's why they wanted the Morrison farm. Perfect central location, established defenses, and a ready-made cover. Story about a retired gunslinger trying to live peacefully. They've been playing a long game, Samuel continued, memories of Kansas mixing with present revelations. The kill gang wasn't just a bunch of murderous outlaws. They were the first wave, testing grounds for what's happening now. My family. His voice caught. My family died because my father discovered what they were planning. Grace moved too, her brother's side taking his hand. Then we stopped them, like you stopped the kill gang. But Samuel shook his head. This is bigger than one man hunting down killers. They've had years to embed themselves in every territory, every level of law enforcement. For every corrupt badge we expose, they probably have 3 more waiting. Then we build something bigger, Michael said firmly. PA's trade network, the Marshal's authority, your particular skills. They're not the only ones who can play a long game. Marshal Hayes straightened, decision made. Morrison, I'm not asking you to wear a badge, but we need what you know, how you think. These men tried to use your home as their base, made it personal. Samuel looked around at the farm he'd built, the family he'd gathered. Everything that had happened, from the horror in Kansas to the peace he'd found here, suddenly seemed connected, as if all paths had led to this moment, this choice. They want to use the shadow shooter's legacy, he said finally. Let's show them what that really means. Over the next hours, as the sun set on the aftermath of battle, plans were made. Thomas Taylor's trade caravans would become a network of intelligence gathering. Marshal Hayes would work to identify and remove corrupt badges, while Michael would coordinate between the various groups. But it was Grace who proposed the most daring plan. The general store, she said. Reed's gone, but the location's still perfect. A way to monitor their movements, just like they monitored us. Too obvious, Samuel started to object, but she cut him off. Not if I run it. Nobody suspects a young woman shopkeeper. And with Michael helping, she squeezed her beau's hand, we can turn their own tactics against them. Samuel studied his sister, seeing not the half-starved girl he'd found in the barn years ago, but a strong woman who'd learned more from watching him than he'd realized. It's dangerous, he said finally. Everything worth doing is, she replied, using his own words against him. You taught me that. As night fell, the farm slowly settled. Hayes's men established patrols, while the farmhands repaired the worst of the battle damage. Samuel stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge, when Joseph joined him. Quite a day, the old cook observed. Found out your quiet farm's been at the center of a territorial conspiracy. Discovered your sister's tougher than boot leather. Learning your whole new life might be even more dangerous than your old one. Samuel smiled slightly. Learned I've got more family than I thought too. People are willing to stand with me, even knowing what's coming. Speaking of family, Joseph said carefully, your pa's wagon was spotted about an hour out, riding hard once he heard the gunfire. Samuel nodded, mentally preparing himself. His father, the Reverend Morrison, had given him a new life, a new purpose after Kansas, had understood about the shadow shooter, about the vengeance that had driven him. But this was different. He'll understand, Grace said, joining them on the porch, like he understood before. Some fights choose us, whether we want them or not. The sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. A single rider emerged from the darkness, leading a familiar wagon. Reverend Morrison's voice carried clearly across the yard. Samuel, Grace, is everyone? We're all fine, Pa, Samuel called back, but he could hear the tension in his own voice. So much had changed in a single day. The peaceful life they'd built, the simple farmer's son he'd tried to become. It all felt like another mask now, another layer of deception stripped away. But as his father's wagon drew closer, Samuel saw something unexpected. The Reverend wasn't alone. Sitting beside him was a face Samuel hadn't seen in 5 years, a man he'd thought long dead in the aftermath of Kansas. "Hello, little brother," the newcomer said softly. "Heard you might need some help with an old problem." And suddenly, Samuel understood. The path that had led him here, from the ashes of his first family to the creation of his second, hadn't been an escape from his past. It had been preparation for what was to come. The shadow shooter had died in Kansas, but something new had risen in his place, something that combined the deadly skills of the Avenger with the protective instincts of a farmer's son, something that could face what was coming, because the night was far from over and the real battle was just beginning. Marcus. Samuel breathed his brother's name like a prayer. They told me, after the fire, that I died. Marcus McAllister, now going by the name John Carter, stepped down from the wagon. Almost did. Took me 3 years to recover enough to start tracking what really happened that night in Kansas. His face bore new scars, but his eyes held the same determined glint, Samuel remembered. Reverend Morrison watched the reunion with knowing eyes. John, Marcus, found me in Prescott 2 months ago. Been helping me understand just how deep this conspiracy runs. Samuel's mind raced through implications. You knew about what was happening here? Knew enough to be ready, the Reverend replied, gesturing to the hidden compartments in his wagon. More weapons, these wrapped in church pamphlets. Your brother wasn't the only one preparing for this day. Grace approached cautiously, studying the uncle she'd never known she had. You're the one who taught Samuel to shoot? Before Kansas, Marcus nodded, his expression softening. Taught him everything I knew, though clearly he learned a few new tricks since then. He surveyed the battlefield that had been their farm. Shadow shooter. Has a nice ring to it. Marshal Hayes emerged from the barn, his face grave. Found more in that hidden room, documents, ledgers, maps of every major trade route through 3 territories. This goes higher than we thought. Goes all the way to Washington, Marcus confirmed. Senators, judges, even a few generals. They're not just building an empire out here, they're creating a power base to influence the whole country. Thomas Taylor joined them, adding his own intelligence. My contacts in San Francisco have been tracking suspicious investment patterns. Someone's buying up land all along the proposed railroad routes, using shell companies and borrowed names. The Gilgang was their first experiment, Marcus continued. See if they could destabilize a region, drive out honest settlers, replace local law with their own people. It worked so well, they expanded the operation. Samuel felt the weight of history settling around them. That's why they went after our family? Because father was a judge who couldn't be bought? Because he was gathering evidence, Marcus corrected. Just like Marshal Phillips was, before they killed him. Just like Grace's real father. Grace's sharp intake of breath drew everyone's attention. You knew my father? Marcus nodded solemnly. Worked with him, trying to expose all this. His death wasn't random, Grace. He died protecting more than just you. Michael, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. The store. That's why they placed. Read here, isn't it? Not just to monitor the valley, but to watch Grace. Make sure she doesn't remember anything. Smart boy, Marcus approved. Though I suspect his interest in my niece isn't purely tactical. The young man flushed, but stood his ground. Love's not tactical, sir, even in the middle of all this. Samuel watched the interplay of revelations and relationships, seeing patterns he'd missed before. You've been coordinating with Thomas Taylor's network? Setting up this moment? Among others, Marcus agreed. There's a resistance building, honest lawmen, merchants, even a few politicians who haven't been corrupted. Tonight wasn't just about stopping Blackwood, it was about revealing their operation here, forcing them to show their hand. And now, Hayes asked, they'll know we've uncovered their weapons cache, their documentation, they'll change their plans. Now, Reverend Morrison spoke with quiet authority. We show them that evil flourishes when good men do nothing. We show them that even an empire built on corruption can fall when people stand together. Samuel looked at his gathered family, blood and chosen alike. Grace, who'd grown from a frightened orphan into a strong woman ready to fight her own. Battles. Michael, whose love had proven stronger than duty. The farmhands who'd revealed themselves as more than simple workers. Marcus, returned from the dead to continue their father's fight for justice. "We'll need a plan," he said finally. "A way to use what we've learned. Coordinate with other resistance cells." "Already have one," Marcus replied. "But it's going to mean sacrificing the peace you've built here, little brother. Are you ready for that?" Samuel touched Colt Walker at his hip, feeling the weight of both past and future. "Peace was never real," he said quietly. "Just a pause. Between battles, a time to gather strength, find purpose beyond revenge." "And what purpose did you find?" Marcus asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew. Samuel looked at Grace, at the family he'd built, at the home he'd created. "The same one that drove our father. Not just fighting against something, but fighting for something. For the chance that others might live in the peace we never had." The night wind carried the scent of rain and gunsmoke, of endings and beginnings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, converting the farm into a resistance headquarters, establishing communication, networks, identifying allies and enemies. But tonight was for understanding, for reunions, for accepting that sometimes the path forward led through the past. "The shadow shooter died in Kansas," Samuel said finally. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe what's needed now isn't a ghost, hunting killers in the dark, but a man standing in the light, showing others they can stand too." Grace took his hand, her grip strong and sure. "Not alone," she said firmly, "never alone again." And as the stars wheeled overhead, as plans were made and bonds strengthened, Samuel Morrison, who had been the shadow shooter who had tried to be just a farmer's son, finally understood. Every step of his journey, every loss and victory had led to this moment. Not an ending, but a beginning, a chance to turn shadow into light. Dawn painted the Arizona sky in shades of amber and gold, but the peaceful scene belied the tension gripping the Morrison farm. In the converted barn, now serving as their operational headquarters, Samuel studied the documents they'd recovered from Blackwood's gang. Marcus's late-night revelations had only scratched the surface of the conspiracy. Silver shipments diverted, land deeds forged, honest marshals assassinated. He muttered, spreading out papers across a makeshift table. "They've been building this for a decade. Longer," Marshal Hayes corrected, pointing to a faded letter. "Look at the date. Their first moves started right after the war, when territories were being organized. While everyone was focused on reconstruction, they were laying groundwork." Thomas Taylor examined a ledger with practiced eyes. "These numbers, they're not just building an empire. They're creating a shadow economy. Every corrupt badge, every displaced farmer, every accident that removes an honest official, it all feeds their system." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Maria appeared at the door, her usual calm demeanor sharpened by urgency. "Riders coming, not military or law, different." Samuel moved to the observation post they'd established in the cupola. Through his spyglass, he counted 6 riders approaching from the east. Their horses were quality stock. Their clothes spoke of wealth, but something about their formation triggered warnings in his mind. "Business suits and banking papers," Marcus observed from beside him. "Same way they took over in Kansas. First come the legitimate businessmen with their offers and threats, then the killers if you refuse. Let them come." Grace's voice carried from below. She stood with Michael and several farmhands, weapons discreetly positioned but ready. "We know their game now." Samuel studied his sister, noting how she'd positioned herself to cover both the main approach and the hidden escape route. She'd learned more than just shooting from watching him all these years. The riders reined up at a respectful distance. Their leader, a distinguished-looking man in an expensive Eastern suit, raising his hands to show they were empty. "Good morning. I represent the Western Territories Development Corporation. hoping to discuss a business opportunity with the property owner. Samuel exchanged glances with Marcus. Western Territories Development, one of the shell companies mentioned. In Blackwood's documents, they weren't wasting any time. Strange hour for business, Samuel called back, maintaining his farmer's son persona one last time. The sun is barely up, the businessman smiled smoothly. Opportunity waits for no man, my friend. We've heard about your recent difficulties. With certain elements, my company offers protection, legitimacy, and a chance to be part of something growing. Something growing, Marcus muttered. Like cancer. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, letting them see him clearly. Behind him, Grace and Michael maintained their concealed positions, while Marshal Hayes and his deputies circled wide through. The pre-dawn shadows had a similar offer once, Samuel said conversationally. Back in Kansas, man in a nice suit talking about progress and opportunity, right before everything burned. The businessman's smile flickered slightly. I assure you, Mr. Morrison, our intentions are purely Samuel McAllister, Samuel interrupted softly. That was my name then, standing on another porch, listening to another suit spin pretty lies right before the kill gang murdered my family. The reaction was subtle but immediate. The rider's hands drifted closer to hidden weapons. The businessman's smile became fixed, artificial. The boy died in Kansas, one of the riders said sharply. With the rest. Stories of my death were greatly exaggerated, Samuel replied, letting the shadow shooter's cold precision seep into his voice. Just like stories of my brother's death, just like the story you're going to take back to your masters. Marcus emerged from the shadows, his appearance causing visible shock among the riders. Hello, Henderson, he said pleasantly. Still playing. Frontman for Killers. How's that working out? The businessman, Henderson, struggled to maintain his composure. Marcus McAllister. We had wondered, but it doesn't matter. You're too late. The contracts are signed. The pieces are in place. This territory, all of them, will be developed according to plan. Development, Samuel's voice carried quiet contempt. That's what you called it in Kansas, too. Burning farms, murdering families, replacing law with corruption, all in the name of progress. Progress is inevitable, Henderson replied, his gentle manner cracking slightly. The weak make way for the strong. It's the natural order. Natural order? Grace stepped into view, Sharp's rifle held ready. Like murdering my father when he discovered your plans? Like trying to kill a child to keep your secrets? Henderson's eyes narrowed. The marshal's daughter. We wondered if you'd survived. Another loose end to tie up. Only loose ends here. Marshal Hayes's voice rang out as he and his deputies emerged from their positions. Are the ones you left in Blackwood saddlebags. Detailed plans, banking records, names of corrupted officials. Quite a collection. The businessman's mask finally cracked completely. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The reach we have, the power built on lies, Samuel cut in, on murder and theft and corruption. But here's what you're going to do, Henderson. You're going to ride back to your masters. Tell them what you found here. A threat, Mr. McAllister? A promise, Marcus corrected. Tell them the shadow shooter didn't die in Kansas. Tell them Judge McAllister's sons are alive and we're finishing what our father started. Tell them their empire of corruption is built on sand and the tide is turning. You'll never expose us, Henderson sneered. Too many pieces in play, too many powerful men invested in our success. You're just farmers and failed lawmen playing at justice. Maybe, Samuel agreed quietly, but we're not alone anymore. He gestured to Thomas Taylor, merchants who track your shipments. To Hayes, honest lawmen who resist your bribes. To the farmhands who'd revealed themselves as more than simple workers. Good people willing to stand against evil. And now, Grace added, her rifle never wavering, you've given us the one thing we needed most, proof. Proof that connects. Every murder, every land grab, every corrupted badge to your masters. Henderson's composure cracked further. Proof can burn, witnesses can die. You've seen how easily... We've seen what fear can do, Samuel interrupted, how it can make good men look away, make them accept evil as inevitable. But we've also seen what happens when people stop being afraid, when they stand together. The sun had risen fully now, burning away the last shadows in the valley. Henderson looked around at the armed men and women surrounding his position, at the determined faces of those who'd chosen to stand against corruption. This isn't over, he said finally. No, Samuel agreed. It's just beginning. Now ride back to your masters. Tell them what you found here. Tell them the shadow they thought they'd destroyed in Kansas has become something new, something stronger. As Henderson and his men rode away, Samuel felt the weight of the moment settle around them. The peaceful life he'd tried to build here was over, transformed into something else, something more important. They'll be back, Marcus said quietly, with everything they have. Let them come, Grace replied firmly. This time we're ready. This time we know what we're fighting for. Samuel watched the riders disappear into the morning haze, thinking about paths and choices. The shadow shooter had been born from tragedy, fueled by vengeance. But what was rising now was something different, something built not just on the skills of a killer, but on the strength of family, the power of truth, the courage of those who chose to stand against evil. The farmer's son was gone, but in his place stood a man who had finally found his true purpose. Not in shadows, but in light. Not in vengeance, but in justice. Not in running from the past, but in building a future worth fighting for. As Henderson's party disappeared into the distance, Reverend Morrison emerged from the house, carrying a worn leather journal. Found this hidden in the cellar last night, while checking our supplies. Think it belongs to your story now, Samuel. The book's cover bore water stains and scorch marks, remnants of that terrible night in Kansas. Samuel opened it carefully, recognizing his father's precise handwriting. Judge McAllister's personal records, Marcus breathed. I thought they'd been lost in the fire. Your father gave it to me, the Reverend explained. The night he brought you to my door, Samuel. Said I'd know when it was time to share it. The journal's pages revealed a careful chronicle of corruption, stretching back even further than they'd imagined. Names, dates, connections, all meticulously documented by a man who'd believed in the power of truth to combat evil. Look at this, Thomas Taylor pointed to an entry. Your father wasn't just tracking land grabs and corrupted officials. He was following the money all the way back to banking houses in New York and London. Marshall Hayes studied the entries with growing concern. These Eastern bankers, they're using the territories as a testing ground. If their methods work here, they'll expand, Marcus finished grimly. Take their system of corruption nationwide, maybe even internationally, control through violence and fear, all hidden behind a veneer of legitimate business, Grace read. Over Samuel's shoulder, her expression hardening. There's more. Notes about other families who resisted, other honest officials who disappeared. We weren't the first to try to silence them. But we were different, Samuel said quietly. Because father wasn't just gathering evidence. He was building a network of his own. Look at these names in the margins. Merchants, lawmen, telegraph operators, people positioned to observe and report. Michael, who'd been examining the farm's defenses, rejoined them. Like what you've built here, without even knowing it. The farmhands who are more than they seem, the trading connections, the strategic position. A foundation for resistance, Marcus nodded approvingly. Just like father planned. He knew they'd eventually overreach, trying to grab too much too fast. Knew someone would need to be ready when that moment came. Maria appeared with fresh coffee, her movements deliberately casual, as she reported. 3 riders spotted on the North Ridge, watching. Not Henderson's men. Samuel exchanged glances with his brother. More players entering the game. Henderson's masters won't be the only ones moving pieces now. Good, Grace said firmly. Let them come. Every shooter they send, every corrupt badge, every fancy businessman, they all leave tracks. Evidence we can use. The Reverend studied his adopted children. Samuel, who'd risen from tragedy to find purpose. Grace, who'd grown from victim to fighter. Even Marcus returned from the dead to continue the fight. Your father believed that evil prospers when good people become convinced they're powerless, when they accept corruption as normal, violence as inevitable. Not anymore, Samuel replied, touching the journal's worn cover. Father gave us the weapons we need, not just guns and information, but the truth about what we're really fighting, the knowledge that we're not alone. Hayes moved to the map. Table, studying the territories with new understanding. We'll need to coordinate with other resistance cells, share information, support each other. Your father's network is still out there, probably grown larger over the years. Already happening, Thomas Taylor confirmed. My trading caravans have been carrying more than goods. Messages, supplies, helping families displaced by their land grabs find new homes, new allies. Michael cleared his throat. The store in town. If Grace and I run it like we discussed, we could... No, Samuel started to object, but Grace cut him off. It's perfect, she insisted. Everyone expects the store to be their eyes and ears. Let it be ours instead. Michael's family connections, my personal history with their operations. We'd be positioned to monitor everything. Samuel studied his sister, seeing not just the woman she'd become, but the future she was choosing. It's dangerous, he said finally. Everything worth doing is, she quoted back at him. You taught me that. Taught me that sometimes safety is just another word for looking away from what needs to be done. Marcus grinned. She's got you there, little brother. Besides, your farmhands aren't the only ones with hidden talents. Grace has learned more than just shooting from watching you all these years. As if to prove his point, Grace moved to the map table, pointing out patterns others had missed. Look here. Their land grabs always follow the same sequence. First, the legitimate buyers like Henderson, then pressure from corrupt officials, finally violence if those fail. But if we know their pattern, we can be waiting, Michael finished, admiration clear in his voice. Turn their own methods against them. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of dawn. Samuel watched his unlikely family, their blood relations and chosen allies alike, begin to plan in earnest. The peaceful life he'd tried to build here hadn't been an ending after all, but a beginning. A gathering of strength, a finding of purpose. Father's last entry, he said suddenly, reading from the journal, written the night before everything changed. Evil wins not through strength, but through the silence of good people, through the belief that one person cannot make a difference, that corruption cannot be fought, that justice is merely a dream. But we're not silent anymore, Grace declared firmly. And we're not alone. Samuel closed the journal carefully, feeling the weight of legacy and choice settle around him. The shadow shooter had been born from tragedy, fueled by vengeance. But what was rising now was something different, something his father had foreseen. A network of resistance, built on courage and truth rather than fear and corruption. The farmer's son was gone, transformed by necessity and choice into something new. Not a ghost hunting in shadows, but a leader standing in light. Not alone. Avenger, but part of something larger, something his father had planned for, had sacrificed everything to make possible. As his gathered family began sharing information and making plans, Samuel felt the last pieces of his carefully maintained facade fall away. The peace he'd sought here had been an illusion, but what was replacing it was something far more valuable, a chance to finish what his father had started, a chance to prove that even the strongest empire of corruption could fall when good people chose to stand together. The war for the territory's soul was just beginning. But for the first time since that terrible night in Kansas, Samuel McAllister, who had been the shadow shooter, who had tried to be just a farmer's son, felt truly ready to fight it, not for vengeance now, but for justice. Not alone, but surrounded by family, both blood and choice. Not in darkness, but in the full light of dawn, the next 3 days transformed the Morrison farm into something that would have been unrecognizable to casual observers. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Hands working the fields, cattle grazing, the daily rhythm of agricultural life continuing undisturbed. But beneath this carefully maintained veneer, change was spreading like wildfire. The barn's hidden room, once used by their enemies to cache weapons, now served as a communication hub. Thomas Taylor's merchant contacts had supplied telegraph, equipment, operated by Maria, whose previous life as a Mexican military code specialist proved invaluable. Messages flowed in from across the territories, each bringing news of other resistance cells awakening. "Report from New Mexico," she announced, her fingers flying over the key. Judge Carlton was found dead in his office. Officially ruled suicide, but he was investigating land deed fraud. Marcus finished grimly. Third honest judge this month. They're accelerating their timeline. Samuel studied the map they'd expanded across the wall, now marked with strings connecting various incidents. Red for murders disguised as accidents, blue for suspicious land sales, black for corrupted officials exposed. The pattern was clear and disturbing. "They're not just reacting to us," he observed. "This was already planned. Henderson's visit wasn't a response to Blackwood's failure. It was the next phase." Grace entered, bringing the afternoon's intelligence gathered from her first day running the general store. "You're right. Overheard 2 railroad surveyors talking. New spur line is planned through the valley. But the official announcement isn't due for months. They're buying up land. Now before prices rise." "Smart," Michael admired, though his expression was troubled. "Once the railroad's announced, any resistance to their land grabs looks like simple greed, not fighting corruption." A commotion outside drew their attention. One of Hayes's deputies rushed in, face flushed with urgency. "Riders coming up from Douglas City, Army patrol, but something's wrong." Samuel and Marcus moved to the observation post. Through their spy glasses, they counted 8 riders in cavalry uniforms escorting a wagon. But Samuel noted details that raised immediate alarms. "Horses are wrong," he muttered. "Army patrols would have matching mounts, and that wagon, supply wagons don't move like that." Marcus nodded grimly. "Too light, too fast, not carrying supplies." "Weapons," Grace concluded, joining them with her Sharps rifle. "Like the cache we found. They're trying to relocate their armory before we can document everything." The Reverend emerged from his study, where he'd been correlating evidence from his old journal with recent events. "There's more. That patrol. The officer's insignia is cavalry, but look at how they ride. Those aren't soldiers." Samuel's mind raced through options. They couldn't let that weapons cache disappear. It was physical evidence linking the conspiracy to military supply theft. But if they moved against what appeared to be a legitimate army patrol— "Maria," he called down, "signal Thomas Taylor's watchers. We need to know if there's any real army patrols in the area." The telegraph clicked rapidly. Moments later, Maria's voice carried urgency. "Real patrol spotted 20 miles east, pursuing Apache raiders. These men are imposters." "Clever," Marcus admitted, "using the Apache troubles as cover for their movements. Anyone questions armed men in uniform, they're just responding to Indian activity." Michael, who had been studying the approaching party through a telescope, suddenly stiffened. "Samuel, the wagon driver, it's Daniel Reed." "What?" Grace swung her rifle to verify. "The snake, probably coming to collect whatever evidence he left behind." Samuel's mind settled into the cold clarity he remembered from his shadow shooter days. Grace, get a word to Hayes. His deputies need to block the South Road, make it look like routine patrol. Michael, have your father's men ready at the creek crossing. Marcus, already moving, his brother replied, heading for the hidden tunnel that would take him behind the approaching party's position. Sir, one of the farmhands called out, dust clouds to the north, more riders are coming. Through his spyglass, Samuel counted at least 15 mounted men approaching fast from the opposite direction. These wore no uniforms, making no attempt to disguise their nature. Hard men riding hard. Henderson's response team, he guessed. Must have figured we'd try to stop the weapons transfer. He turned to the Reverend. Time for your part of the plan, Pa. The older man nodded, understanding. For 3 days, he'd been seen making obvious preparations to evacuate the farm, loading wagons, gathering valuables. All part of the performance, making their enemies believe fear was working. Right on schedule, the Reverend's wagon train began moving out, heading east along the main road. From a distance, it looked like exactly what Henderson's masters would expect, a family fleeing after being threatened. The fact that the wagons were actually filled with armed men positioned to flank any attack would come as a nasty surprise. They're coordinating, Grace observed as both groups adjusted their approach. The fake patrol and Henderson's men, 2 forces trying to box us in. Samuel allowed himself a small smile. 3 forces, actually. Look, a 3rd group had appeared, smaller, but moving with clear purpose along the ridgeline. These riders wore badges that glinted in the afternoon sun. Blackwood's remaining men, Michael identified, coming to take revenge for their leader. All our enemies, Samuel mused, converging from different directions, almost like someone wanted them to. Marcus's voice carried through the speaking tube they'd installed. He'd reached his position overlooking the creek crossing, like someone planned for this moment. Understanding bloomed. Samuel looked at his father's journal, at the carefully documented patterns of corruption. Father knew they'd eventually overreach, try to grab too much too fast. That's why he chose this valley, why he made sure I found my way here. A trap, Grace breathed. Not just this farm, this whole situation. We're not just fighting back against their plan. We're executing Father's plan, Samuel finished. 5 years in the making, drawing them out, making them reveal themselves all at once. The approaching forces had spotted each other now, their movements becoming more coordinated. To any observer, it would appear the Morrison farm was about to be overwhelmed from 3 directions. But appearances, Samuel had learned, could be deceiving. Marshal Hayes's deputies were already moving into position, using the creek bed for cover. Thomas Taylor's men had secured the high ground, while the Reverend's wagon train could swing around behind any force that committed to an attack. They think they're springing a trap, Marcus observed through the speaking tube. Don't realize they're riding into one. Samuel checked his weapons one final time. Not just the guns, but the evidence they'd gathered, the witnesses they'd protected, the truth they'd uncovered, his father's last gift, finally bearing fruit. Grace, signal the store. Tell them to implement the next phase. His sister smiled grimly. Already done. Every telegraph operator in 3 territories who's still honest is sending the same message. Every newspaper that hasn't been bought, every marshal who hasn't been corrupted. They're all getting proof of the conspiracy right now. Won't stop these men, Michael cautioned, indicating the approaching forces. No, Samuel agreed. These ones have to be stopped another way. He turned to Maria. Signal Marcus. Tell him to let Daniel Reed's group get close to the barn. They'll want to check their hidden room, where they'll find more than just weapons, the Reverend finished. They'll find the truth, and truth, my son, is the one thing their kind cannot survive. The sun hung low on the horizon now, painting the valley in shades of amber and shadow. Samuel watched the forces of corruption converging on his home, seeing not a desperate last stand, but the culmination of years of planning. His father's foresight, Marcus's survival, Grace's strength, the gathering of allies and evidence, all of it leading to this moment. The shadow shooter had been born from tragedy, fueled by vengeance, but what would emerge from today's battle would be something else entirely. Something built not just on skill with a gun, but on the power of truth to combat lies, of justice to overcome corruption, of good people standing together against evil. Stay tuned. Farmer's son was gone, transformed into something his enemies had never expected. Not just a killer in the dark, but a leader in the light. Not just an avenger, but a protector. Not just a shadow, but a beacon for others to follow. As the enemy forces drew closer, Samuel felt the last piece of his father's legacy slot into place. The trap was set, the truth was spreading, and the real battle for the soul of the territories was about to begin. Through the speaking tube, Marcus's voice carried urgent news. Daniel Reed's splitting his group. 6 riders continue toward the barn, but he's taking the wagon east, trying to skirt around our position. Let him, Samuel replied. Grace, his sister, was already moving. Michael and I have the East Ridge covered. If Reed thinks he knows all our hidden trails, he's about to learn differently. Samuel watched through his spyglass as Henderson's men began spreading out in textbook military formation. Their leader might be a businessman, but someone in that. A group had serious cavalry training. They're good, the Reverend observed. Notice how they're using the terrain, keeping the sun at their backs? Too good, Samuel agreed. Those aren't just hired guns, former military probably, men who learned about war during the rebellion, then found peace didn't suit them. Maria's fingers flew across the telegraph key. Message from Hayes. His deputies are in position, but they've spotted more riders approaching from the south, at least 20. Reinforcements? Michael asked. No, Marcus replied, his voice grim. Look at how Henderson's men just shifted position. They didn't expect this group either. Samuel studied the new arrivals through his spyglass. Unlike the other forces, these riders made no attempt at concealment or military precision. They rode hard and straight, their horses lathered with effort. Apache, the Reverend identified. Real ones, not the fake raid the army's chasing. They must have spotted the weapons wagon. The situation had just become exponentially more complex. 4 separate forces converging on the farm, each with their own agenda. Any wrong move could spark a massacre. We need to adjust the plan, Michael started, but Samuel was already shaking his head. This is the plan, he said quietly. Father's journal, look at the pattern. The conspiracy doesn't just rely on corruption and violence. It needs chaos, creates problems, then offers solutions for a price. Understanding bloomed across faces around him. The Apache raids, the army patrols, the land grabs, all connected, all manipulated to serve the conspirators' goals. They're doing it everywhere, Grace realized, stirring up Indian troubles to justify military presence, using that presence to pressure settlers, creating the very problems they claim to solve. And now they're all here, Samuel continued. Every piece of their operation was exposed at once. The fake soldiers, the corrupt badges, the legitimate businessmen, and the real victims of their games. Maria's telegraph clicked urgently. Signal from Thomas Taylor's lookouts. Army patrols changed direction. The real one. They've spotted the Apache. The pieces were moving faster now, the trap becoming something larger and more complex than even they had planned. Samuel felt time slow, his mind settling into the crystalline clarity he remembered from his shadow shooter days. Grace, Michael, maintain position, but hold your fire. The Apache needed to see Reed's wagon reach the East Trail. Marcus? Ready. Got a clear shot at their officer. Just say the word. Not yet. Maria, signal Hayes. His deputies need to be visible to Henderson's men, but not to the Apache. Make them think the law's choosing sides. The Reverend watched his adopted son with knowing eyes. You're not just stopping a weapons shipment, you're showing them all the truth. Samuel nodded. Slowly, the Apache need to see who's really been arming their enemies. Henderson's men need to see who they're really working for, and when the real army arrives, they'll find evidence of weapons theft, land fraud, and corruption, Grace finished, all wrapped up in one neat package. Through his spyglass, Samuel watched the forces draw closer. The fake patrol had reached the farm's outer fields, while Henderson's men moved to cut off any escape to the west. The Apache were closing fast from the south, and Reed's wagon was approaching the very trail where Grace and Michael waited. "It's going to get bloody," Marcus warned through the tube. "Yes," Samuel agreed, "but this time the blood will mean something. This time the truth won't stay buried." The sun touched the western mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and shadow. In the barn below, Maria's telegraph continued clicking out their gathered evidence to every honest newspaper and lawman in 3 territories. The Reverend's wagons had completed their circle, ready to reveal their armed cargo. Hayes's deputies and Thomas's men waited in their hidden positions. Samuel checked his weapons one final time, the Winchester for distance, the Colt for close work. But his most powerful weapon was the truth they'd gathered, the evidence they'd protected, the plan his father had set in motion years ago. "Samuel," Grace's voice carried softly through the speaking tube. "Reed's almost in position. Do we take him?" "Not yet," he replied, watching the complex dance of forces through his spyglass. "Wait until—" A shot rang out from the south, followed by war cries. The Apache had spotted the weapons wagon. Reed's escort wheeled to face the new threat, while Henderson's men suddenly found themselves caught between advancing Indians and what appeared to be law enforcement. The fake patrol officers showed their true colors, abandoning military precision to rush toward their hidden cache in the barn. Their leader, finally visible in Samuel's spyglass, was a face from the past. One of the Kansas kill gang's lieutenants, long thought dead. "Now," Samuel said quietly, "show them all the truth." The valley erupted into carefully orchestrated chaos. Grace and Michael's rifles spoke from the ridge, separating Reed from his escort. The Reverend's wagons shed their canvas covers, revealing armed men who cut off Henderson's force from retreat. Hayes's deputies emerged at precisely the right moment to make the conspiracy's men believe they were being betrayed. And through it all, Samuel watched from above, seeing not just the physical battle, but the larger war it represented. A war between truth and lies, between justice and corruption, between those who would build empires on suffering and those who would stand against them. The farmer's son was truly gone now, transformed into something else. Not just a fighter, but a leader. Not just an avenger, but a force for justice. Not just a shadow, but a light showing others the way forward. The real battle for the territory's soul had begun, and Samuel Morrison, who had been the shadow shooter, who had tried to be just a farmer's son, was finally ready to face it, not alone, but surrounded by family and allies. Not in darkness, but in the full light of truth, not for vengeance, but for the future his father had died believing in. Chaos erupted across the valley, but it was chaos with purpose. Each shot, each movement, each reaction carefully calculated to expose the truth. The Apache warriors, realizing they'd ridden into something far more complex than a simple weapons raid, split into smaller groups, their tactical flexibility showing years of experience. Daniel Reed's wagon hadn't made it 50 yards down the east trail before Grace and Michael's precise shooting separated him from his escort. The former shopkeeper found himself caught between advancing Apache warriors and the very people whose trust he'd betrayed. "Reed," Grace's voice carried across the distance. "Remember what you said when I first came to town, about how this valley needed honest folk? The shopkeeper's response was to abandon his wagon and make a desperate run for the tree line. But Samuel had anticipated this, had known that men like Reed would turn cowardly when their schemes unraveled. Through his spyglass, Samuel watched the fake patrol's leader finally recognize his position. The man's scarred face triggered memories of Kansas. Lieutenant James Sawback Curtis, one of the kill gang's most vicious members. "That's why they chose this territory," Samuel muttered. "Curtis has been here all along, building their operation right under our noses." Marcus's voice crackled through the speaking tube. "He recognizes me. Should have seen his face when he spotted movement up here. Man looks like he's seen a ghost." "He has," Samuel replied grimly. "Two of them." The valley had become a complex battlefield, with multiple forces maneuvering for advantage. Henderson's men, realizing they were caught between Apache warriors and what appeared to be law enforcement, began to fragment. Some tried to fight their way clear, while others raised their hands in surrender. But Curtis and his fake patrol showed the discipline that had made them deadly in Kansas. They'd reached the barn's hidden room, only to find it rigged with more than just weapons. "Fire!" Curtis's voice carried clearly. "Burn it all! Don't let them find the papers!" "Now, Maria," Samuel commanded. The Mexican woman's fingers flew across the telegraph key one final time. Then she threw the switch they'd prepared. The barn's hidden room erupted not in flames, but in a cascade of papers, evidence scattered by cleverly placed fans powered by a modified windmill. Documents detailing land fraud, weapons theft, and corruption rained down across the battlefield like deadly snow. "My God," Michael breathed, watching through his scope. "Curtis's face. He knows what those papers mean." Samuel nodded grimly. "Proof connecting him to Kansas, to the kill gang, to everything they've built here. His masters can't deny involvement now." Henderson's voice cut through the chaos, the businessman's cultivated manner cracking. "Kill them all! Don't let any of those papers leave the valley!" But it was too late. The Apache warriors, initially focused on the weapons wagon, had seen enough to understand the larger game. Their leader, a tall man Samuel recognized from his father's journal descriptions, raised a hand to halt his warriors' advance. "Your fight," the Apache chief called out in clear English, "reveals much, Shadow Shooter. These men," he gestured, to Curtis's group, "they arm our enemies, then sell protection to whites, create war for profit." Samuel had counted on this moment, and had known that the Apache's legendary tactical intelligence would grasp the truth when presented properly. "They've been playing us all, Chief Running Fox, using your people's fight for survival to mask their own corruption." The chief's response was cut short by new gunfire. Daniel Reed had reached the trees, only to run straight into Thomas Taylor's hidden men. The shopkeeper's desperate shot went wide, answered by more precise fire that sent him scrambling back toward the open ground. Curtis, seeing his position deteriorating, made a final desperate gambit. "Morrison!" he shouted. "Or McAllister! Or whatever you're calling yourself now. Face me. Finish what started in Kansas." Samuel felt the weight of choice settle around him. This was the moment his father's journal had predicted, when personal vengeance and larger justice would intersect, when the shadow shooter's skills and the farmer's son's wisdom would need to merge into something new. "Grace," he called through the speaking tube. "You and Michael hold position. Watch for already moving," his sister replied, understanding as always. "We've got the high ground covered. No one interferes." Samuel descended from his observation post, each step measured and deliberate. The fighting had largely ceased, all attention now focused on the coming confrontation. Even the Apache warriors watched with keen interest, recognizing the moment's significance. Curtis stood in the barn's doorway, his cavalry uniform now stripped away to reveal the killer beneath. "Should have finished you in Kansas, boy. You and your brother both." "Maybe," Samuel agreed, moving into the open yard. "But then you wouldn't have led us to all this. Wouldn't have helped us expose everything your masters built. The killer's face twisted. Built? We built civilization, boy. Brought progress to these territories, while weak men like your father hid behind laws and morals. Progress. The Reverend's voice carried clearly as he emerged from cover. Is that what you call murder? Corruption? Using good men's weaknesses to turn them into monsters? Curtis's gun hand twitched. Preacher, you don't want to be part of this. Your adopted son, your whole family, they're part of a dying breed. The territories belong to men like us now, men who understand that power is the only law that matters. The Apache chief's laugh was cold as mountain wind. Power? You speak of power while hiding behind false badges, false uniforms, while creating wars you do not fight. They don't understand real power. Marcus called down from his position. Never did. That's why they had to kill honest men like our father, why they have to corrupt everything they touch. Samuel moved forward another step, letting his duster fall open to reveal his holstered Colt. This was never about progress, Curtis, never about civilization, just greed wearing a false face. Using men like Blackwood, like Reed, like all those corrupted badges to build your empire of lies. Lies that worked, Curtis snarled. Look around you. We own these territories. Every judge, every marshal, every businessman who matters is part of our organization. You can't stop what's coming. Already have. Samuel's voice carried quiet certainty. While you were focused here, Maria's telegraph was spreading the truth. Every honest newspaper, every uncorrupted lawman, they're all receiving proof of what you've built. Your masters can't hide anymore. The killer's face showed a moment of doubt, quickly replaced by desperate rage. Then I'll do what I should have done in Kansas, end the McAllister line once and for all. Time slowed as Curtis went for his gun. Samuel saw everything with crystal clarity. The way the killer's weight shifted, the subtle tell in his shoulder. That telegraphed his draw. The same moves he'd used in Kansas when he'd helped murder a family whose only crime was believing in justice. Samuel's own draw was pure instinct, the motion so smooth it seemed the Colt materialized in his hand. But this wasn't the shadow shooter's vengeful speed, or even the calculated precision he'd used against Blackwood's men. This was something new, the perfect merger of what he had been and what he had become. The shots rang out simultaneously, but only Samuel remained standing. Curtis staggered, looking down at the spreading red stain with almost comical surprise. "How?" the killer gasped. "You're just a farmer's son." "No," Samuel replied quietly. "I'm what my father believed in. What this land needs. A man who understands that sometimes justice needs shadows to work in, but shadows need light to guide them." Curtis fell, and with him fell the last remnants of Samuel's old life. The shadow shooter's vengeance was finally complete, but it had been transformed into something larger, something his father would have recognized and approved. The valley grew quiet as Henderson's remaining men surrendered. The Apache warriors, led by their chief, moved to secure the weapons wagon, not to take it, but to ensure its contents would be documented, proof of the conspiracy's attempts. To profit from their people's struggles, Marshal Hayes emerged from cover, his deputies already moving to take custody of prisoners. "It's done then?" "This part," Samuel agreed, "but the real work's just starting. Their masters will try to bury this, claiming Curtis and Henderson were acting alone." "Let them try," Grace declared, joining them with Michael at her side. "The truth's out now. Good people everywhere will know what to look for, how to resist." The Reverend studied his adopted children, Samuel, who had transformed vengeance into justice, Grace, who had turned victimhood into strength, even Marcus, descending from his sniper's perch to stand with his family. "Your father would be proud," the older man said quietly, "not just of what you've done, but of what you've become. What you've helped others become. Samuel looked around at his gathered allies, the Apache warriors who had recognized truth when shown it, the merchants and lawmen who had chosen to stand against corruption, the family he had built from the ashes of tragedy. The farmer's son was truly gone now, but what had replaced him was something far more valuable. Not just a hunter in shadows or a man hiding from his past, but a leader who understood that real justice required both darkness and light, both strength and mercy. The sun touched the western mountains, painting the valley in shades of ending and beginning. One chapter of their story was over, but another was just starting. The Shadow Shooter's vengeance had been transformed into something larger, a legacy of justice that would spread far beyond one family's tragedy. And in that transformed legacy, Samuel Morrison, who had been the Shadow Shooter, who had tried to be just a farmer's son, finally found his true purpose. In the days following the battle at Morrison Farm, change swept through the territories like a cleansing wind. Telegraph offices hummed with activity as Maria's distributed evidence reached every corner of the frontier. Corrupt officials fled, honest lawmen stepped forward, and the conspiracy's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. But at the farm itself, more personal transformations were taking place. Samuel stood in the newly rebuilt barn, examining the hidden room that had once cached their enemies' weapons. Now it held something far more powerful, a growing collection of documents, testimonies, and evidence from others who had discovered similar corruption in their own communities. "Third letter this week," Grace announced, entering with fresh mail from the store she now ran openly as a communication hub. "This one's from a rancher up in Dakota Territory. Says he's been fighting the same kind of land grabs we exposed here." Samuel studied the letter, recognizing patterns that matched his father's journal. They really did try to build this everywhere. Same methods, same corruption, same false progress, hiding greed. "But now people know what to look for," Michael added, sorting through reports from his father's trade network. "Every day brings more evidence, more witnesses stepping forward. The darkness can't hide anymore." Chief Running Fox arrived as they spoke, his presence at the farm no longer unusual. The Apache leader had proven an invaluable ally in tracking the conspiracy's weapon shipments and exposing their attempts to profit from manufactured conflicts. "My scouts bring news," the chief announced without preamble. "Henderson's masters gather in San Francisco, plan new strategies, seek ways to rebuild what was lost here." "Let them try," Marcus called down from the observation post he'd made on his own. "Every move they make now will be watched. Every scheme is exposed." The Reverend emerged from his study, where he'd been corresponding with other religious leaders about using their pulpits to spread truth rather than accepting comfortable lies. "It's not just about watching and exposing anymore. We're building something new here, something your father saw the need for, even if he didn't live to see it happen." Samuel nodded, understanding blooming. The Morrison farm had become more than just a homestead or even a fortress. It was transforming into a symbol, a beacon for others fighting similar battles across the frontier. Marshal Hayes arrived as they discussed this, bringing fresh news from territorial authorities. "Governors approved our proposal," he announced, with satisfaction. "The farm's officially designated as a training center for law enforcement, a place where honest badges can learn to recognize and resist corruption." "More than that," Thomas Taylor added, joining them with his own reports. "My Merchants' Council has voted to establish regular trade routes centered here, not just for goods, but for information, a network of eyes and ears watching for any sign of the conspiracy trying to rebuild." Grace smiled at the growing bustle of activity around what had once been their quiet farm. "Samuel, remember what you told me when you first found me hiding in this barn? About how sometimes safety means more than just strong walls and loaded guns?" About how real security comes from people standing together, he remembered, from building something worth protecting. The afternoon brought more visitors, settlers seeking advice on protecting their land rights, lawmen looking to share intelligence, even a newspaper editor wanting to document the true story of how a farmer's son had helped expose a territory-spanning conspiracy. But it was the arrival of a dust-covered rider from Kansas that truly marked how much had changed. The man introduced himself as David McAllister, their father's former clerk, bearing documents that had been hidden away since that terrible night. "Judge McAllister gave these to me just before it happened," David explained, handling the papers reverently. "Said I'd know when it was time to bring them out. When I read about what happened here, about the shadow shooter being his son, the documents revealed even more of their father's foresight, detailed records of how the conspiracy had first formed, of the men who had turned frontier expansion into a tool for personal empire. But more importantly, they contained lists of those who had resisted, who had chosen justice over profit, truth over comfortable lies. A network." Marcus breathed, examining the papers. Father wasn't just gathering evidence against evil. He was finding good people, connecting them, preparing for a time when they'd need to stand together. And now they are standing. Michael observed. Every day brings more allies, more people choosing to fight rather than submit. Samuel watched the activity around his transformed home. Apache warriors training honest lawmen in tracking techniques, merchants exchanging intelligence with settlers, his sister teaching young women how to turn seemingly helpless positions into sources of strength. The shadow shooter's skills were still needed sometimes when corruption turned violent or truth needed protection, but those skills now served a larger purpose. Guided by the wisdom Samuel had gained as a farmer's son, trying to build something worthy of his father's sacrifice. "We've become what they feared most," Grace said softly, reading another letter from someone seeking help against land grabbers, not just fighters or farmers or lawmen, but something new, something that combines all of those into what Father believed in, Samuel finished. A force for justice that works in both light and shadow, that fights not just with guns and evidence, but with hope and truth. The Reverend approached, carrying yet another telegraph message. "Word from the capital. The territorial governor wants to meet, discuss formalizing our role in law enforcement training." But Samuel was already shaking his head. "We can't be official, Pa, can't be tied to any one authority. What we're building here needs to stay independent, free to act wherever corruption appears." "Like a shadow that serves the light," Marcus agreed from his perch. Chief Running Fox nodded approvingly. "Your father was a wise man, Shadow Shooter, saw that Frontier needed a new kind of warrior, not just a man with a gun, but a man who understands both darkness and light, who builds strength in others, not just use his own." The sun began its westward descent, painting the valley in familiar shades of gold and shadow. But Samuel saw the land differently now, understanding at last the full scope of his father's vision. The Morrison farm had become a crucible where justice was forged from the raw materials of frontier life. Strength and wisdom, courage and compassion, the ability to fight tempered by the understanding of when not to fight. The shadow shooter's vengeance had been transformed into something his father would have recognized and blessed. Not just a force for punishment, but a catalyst for change. Not just a defender of truth, but a teacher of resistance against corruption. And Samuel himself had undergone the greatest transformation of all. The lost son seeking vengeance had become a builder of hope. The killer in the shadows had learned to serve the light. The farmer's son had grown into something that combined the best of every role he'd played. As evening approached, bringing another day of purpose to its close, Samuel stood on his porch, watching the activity that never quite ceased now. Grace and Michael heading to town to manage their information network. Marcus coordinated with Apache scouts about suspicious movements near the border. The Reverend counseled those who had chosen to stand against corruption and needed strength. For the fight ahead, the quiet farm he'd tried to build had become something else entirely, exactly what his father had intended all along. A place where justice was more than just law, where strength served truth, where good people could find the support they needed to resist evil. The farmer's son was gone, but what had replaced him was something far more valuable, a legacy of resistance that would spread across the territories, touching lives far beyond one family's tragedy, a force for justice that worked in both shadow and light, teaching others to recognize and resist corruption wherever it appeared. And in that legacy, Samuel Morrison, who had been the shadow shooter, who had tried to be just a farmer's son, found something his father had died believing in, not just an end to vengeance, but a beginning of hope. 6 months after the battle that had exposed the conspiracy, winter painted the Morrison farm in shades of white and grey. But beneath the peaceful blanket of snow, activity continued unabated. The barn, now expanded with new additions, hummed with the sound of telegraph keys and quiet discussions as information flowed in from across the territories. Samuel stood at his customary observation post, but his attention wasn't on external threats today. Instead, he studied the document Maria had just decoded, a message from San Francisco that carried troubling implications. "They're adapting," he told the gathered council in the barn's main room, "learning from their failures here. Instead of using obvious force and corruption, they're going subtle. Legal maneuvers, banking regulations, railroad right-of-way laws." "Smart," Thomas Taylor admitted, examining the evidence. "Hard to fight an enemy that hides behind legitimate business and proper paperwork." Grace, who had proven remarkably adept at understanding the conspiracy's new methods, pointed to a pattern in recent land transfers. "Look here. They're using proxy buyers, people with clean reputations, no direct connections to Henderson's group or the old network. Like a snake shedding its skin," Marcus observed from his position near the door. "Same creature, new appearance." The afternoon brought more visitors seeking help, but these weren't the desperate settlers and threatened farmers of 6 months. Ego, a banker from Denver, impeccably dressed, requested a private meeting to discuss suspicious patterns in recent loan applications. A railroad surveyor shared documents suggesting altered route plans that would mysteriously benefit certain investors. "It's not just about land and badges anymore," Michael said, reviewing the growing evidence. "They're trying to control the territory's future through money and laws, not just force." Chief Running Fox, who had arrived with his own troubling news, nodded in understanding. "Like winter snakes, they hide beneath peaceful snow, strike when prey thinks danger has passed." The Reverend emerged from his study, where he'd been corresponding with contacts in Eastern financial circles. "They're not just rebuilding their operation here. Similar patterns are appearing in other territories, even some established states. The corruption is spreading, becoming more sophisticated." Samuel felt the weight of new responsibility settling around him. The shadow shooter's skills, so vital in confronting direct violence, seemed less suited to this evolving threat. But perhaps that was part of his father's plan too, forcing him to grow beyond the simple solutions of gun and badges. "We need to adapt as well," he said finally. "Can't fight bank loans with bullets or expose financial fraud with just tracking skills." "Already working on that," Grace replied, sharing a look with Michael. "The store's become more than just an information hub. We're teaching people to recognize the subtle signs, strange patterns in property assessments, suspicious timing of foreclosures, seemingly legitimate business deals that hide darker purposes." Marshal Hayes arrived as they discussed this, bringing news from the territorial capital. "Governors under pressure," he reported grimly. Eastern investors threatening to withdraw support unless certain banking regulations are modernized, their word for weakened. Same tactics they used in Kansas, Marcus remembered, before they turned to violence. Economic pressure first, then corruption of officials, finally force when other methods fail. But Samuel saw something his brother had missed. No, it's different. This time, they learned from their failures. Violence exposed them, made their methods obvious. Now they're using the very systems meant to protect people. Banks, laws, regulations. Like poison in a well, Chief Running Fox observed. Harder to fight than man with a gun. A commotion outside drew their attention. Maria rushed in from the telegraph office carrying a fresh decode. Message from Judge Carlton in New Mexico. Banking consortium pushing new territorial lending laws. Same group tied to Henderson's old operations. Samuel studied the message, seeing patterns within patterns. They're not just adapting their methods, they're trying to change the rules of the game entirely, make their corruption legal, their theft legitimate. Can we stop them? Michael asked. Fighting men with guns is one thing, but laws and banks? We adapt too, Grace declared firmly. The store's already teaching people about property rights and banking laws. We expand that, creating a network of financially literate settlers who can recognize and resist these new tactics. Thomas Taylor nodded approvingly. My merchants can help. We see money flows, recognize suspicious patterns in trade, can teach others what to watch for. The Reverend added his own insight. The pulpit can speak against financial corruption as easily as physical violence, help people understand that evil wears many faces, uses many tools. Samuel watched the discussion unfold, seeing his gathered family and allies tackle this new challenge with the same determination they'd shown against more direct threats. The Morrison farm was evolving again, becoming not just a center of resistance against violent corruption, but a school for fighting subtler forms of evil. A rider arrived from town, one of Grace's new network of informants who worked in banks and business offices. The young woman, barely 20 but with sharp eyes that missed little, brought documents showing how the conspiracy's new tactics were being implemented locally. They're using legitimate businesses as fronts, she explained, spreading papers across the table. Good reputations to hide suspicious dealings, like Mr. Reed's store used to do, but more sophisticated. Samuel studied the evidence, remembering his father's words about evil adapting, finding new ways to prey on good people. The shadow shooter had been born to fight direct violence, but Judge McAllister's son needed to become something more. We build on what we've learned, he said finally. The networks we've created, the trust we've earned, they're worth more than guns now. We teach people to recognize corruption in all its forms, to resist it with knowledge as much as force. Chief Running Fox, who had been quietly observing, spoke with approval. Wise warriors learn many weapons, not just guns and knives, but wisdom and truth. You become what territory needs, Shadow Shooter. Teacher as much as fighter. The winter day began to fade, but activity at the farm continued. In the expanded barn, Maria trained new telegraph operators to recognize coded messages. Grace and Michael counseled settlers on protecting their legal rights. The Reverend prepared sermons that would help his congregation understand the spiritual cost of accepting comfortable lies. Samuel moved through it all, seeing how his home had evolved yet again. The fortress built to resist violence had become a school for fighting corruption in all its forms. The networks created to share military intelligence now carried financial wisdom and legal knowledge. Father would approve, Marcus said quietly, joining him at the observation post. He saw this coming, you know, in his journal, notes about economic warfare, about how frontier justice would need to evolve. Samuel nodded, understanding blooming. The judge's son and the shadow shooter had finally merged into something new, something that could face this evolving threat. Not just a fighter in the darkness or a teacher in the light, but a force for justice that could adapt as evil adapted. The winter sun touched the western mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of purple and gold. But Samuel saw beyond the peaceful scene, recognizing the invisible battles being fought with paperwork and banking laws instead of guns and badges. The farmer's son was truly gone now, transformed into something his father had foreseen, not just a defender against violence, but a teacher of resistance in all its forms. Not just a shadow fighting corruption, but a light showing others how to recognize and resist it. And in that transformation, Samuel Morrison, who had been the shadow shooter who had tried to be just a farmer's son, found his father's legacy growing into something even larger than justice. Hope, taught and shared, becoming stronger than any weapon. Spring brought more than just thawing snow to the Morrison farm. New faces appeared daily, not just settlers seeking protection or lawmen sharing intelligence, but bankers willing to expose fraud, lawyers offering knowledge of legal defense, even politicians ready to stand against corruption. The conspiracy's evolution had forced an evolution in resistance. But with the spring thaw came a new threat, one that tested everything Samuel and his allies had built. It arrived in the form of a letter, delivered not to the farm, but to Grace's store in town. The envelope bore an Eastern postmark and expensive paper. "It's from Henderson," Grace announced, studying the document in the farm's council room. But not a threat, an invitation. The Western Territories Development Corporation is holding a stockholders' meeting in San Francisco. They want representatives from every major territory present. Samuel examined the letter, noting the quality of the paper, the precise legal language. "They're going legitimate, just like we thought, making their corruption look respectable." "Not just respectable," Michael added, pointing to attached documents showing the corporation's recent acquisitions. "They're becoming essential: banking, railroads, mining rights. They're positioning themselves so the territories can't function without them." Marcus, who had spent months tracking the conspiracy's new methods, saw the trap immediately. "If we ignore the invitation, we look unreasonable. If we attend, we legitimize their operation." "There's more," Maria called from the telegraph office. Similar invitations had gone to every major landowner and business leader in 3 territories. The corporation was consolidating power not through violence or obvious corruption, but through economic necessity and social pressure. "They're building something worse than an empire of corruption," the Reverend observed. "They're creating a system where honest people have to participate in corruption just to survive." Chief Running Fox, arriving with his own intelligence, understood immediately. Like winter forcing hungry deer to bad grazing grounds, they no longer hunt their prey, they make prey come to them. Samuel felt the weight of decision settling around him. The shadow shooter's instincts warned of danger, but simply refusing to attend would play into the conspiracy's hands. They needed to adapt again, find new ways to fight on this unfamiliar battlefield. "We accept," he said finally, "but not as victims or witnesses. We use their own tactics against them." Grace caught his meaning first. "The store's records, all the evidence we've gathered about their methods. If we can expose it during their own meeting," "Not just expose," Michael added, understanding blooming. "We use their legitimate business gathering to show other stockholders what they're really investing in." The next weeks transformed the Morrison farm into a different kind of operational center. Instead of practicing shooting or tracking, people studied banking laws and corporate regulations. Grace's store became a classroom where settlers learned to recognize predatory loans and fraudulent contracts. Thomas Taylor's merchant network proved invaluable, providing detailed records of suspicious business patterns across the territories. Marshall Hayes contributed evidence of how seemingly legitimate business decisions had led to violence and displacement. But it was the Reverend who provided the most crucial insight. "Look at their invitation list," he said, studying the gathered intelligence. "Every name represents someone who's been hurt by their operations, who's lost land or money to their schemes. They think making these people stockholders will buy their silence. Instead," Samuel realized, "it gives us a room full of witnesses. People who can testify to their methods, who can help others recognize the pattern. The conspiracy's adaptation had forced them to adapt in turn." The shadow shooter's skills weren't forgotten. Samuel still maintained his shooting practice, still watched for physical threats. But now those skills serve a larger strategy. A young banker arrived from Denver, bringing crucial information about how the corporation manipulated loan terms and property assessments. A railroad engineer shared documents showing how route changes were used to pressure landowners. Even a territorial judge, one of the few who had resisted corruption, offered legal perspectives on fighting economic warfare. "They're not just changing tactics," Marcus observed, watching the farm's transformation. "They're changing the whole nature of frontier conflict, making it about papers and profits instead of guns and badges." Samuel nodded, seeing the pattern their father had predicted in his journal. The frontier's changing. Violence is too obvious, too easily exposed. They want control that looks legitimate, that makes resistance seem unreasonable. Grace, who had been studying Eastern newspapers, saw even further. It's not just about the territories anymore. They're creating a model. If it works here, they'll use it everywhere. Make corruption so normal, so necessary, that honest people have to participate just to survive. The spring days lengthened as preparations continued. Maria's telegraph network tracked stock purchases and property transfers, building a detailed picture of how the conspiracy had adapted. The Apache scouts reported increased railroad surveying activity, all focusing on lands that would soon be legally acquired. Samuel watched it all from his observation post, seeing not just the physical movements, but the invisible flow of money and influence. The fortress they'd built against violence was becoming something else, a school for fighting corruption in all its forms. A week before the stockholders' meeting, an unexpected visitor arrived. David McAllister, their father's former clerk, brought additional documents from Kansas. "Found these in an old land office," he explained. "Records of how they first developed these methods, how they learned to make corruption look like progress." The documents revealed a pattern spanning decades, how the conspiracy had evolved from simple land grabs and violent intimidation to sophisticated financial manipulation. But they also showed something else. "Look at this." Grace pointed to a series of notes in their father's handwriting. He wasn't just gathering evidence against them. He was creating a blueprint for fighting them, for teaching others to resist. Samuel studied his father's words, seeing the wisdom that had looked far beyond simple justice. Judge McAllister had foreseen this evolution and had understood that frontier justice would need to change as the frontier itself changed. "We're not just fighting for land anymore," he said quietly. "We're fighting for the future, for what these territories will become." The morning they departed for San Francisco dawned clear and promising. The Morrison farm had been transformed yet again, from fortress to school to something new. A center for resistance that worked not just through force, but through knowledge. Not just through confrontation, but through understanding. Grace and Michael would attend the stockholders' meeting as legitimate business owners. Marshall Hayes and Thomas Taylor would represent law enforcement and merchant interests. Even Chief Running Fox would send representatives, ensuring the native voice was heard. Samuel watched the preparations, seeing how far they'd come from the days of simple vengeance. The shadow shooter's skills had been transformed, adapted to fight on new battlefields where the weapons were words and wisdom rather than guns and badges. Father would be proud. Marcus said quietly, joining him at the observation post. We've become more than he hoped for. Not just fighters against corruption, but teachers of resistance. Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of legacy and change. The farmer's son was truly gone now, replaced by something that combined all he had been and learned. Not just a hunter in shadows or a teacher in light, but a force for justice that could adapt as evil adapted. And in that adaptation, in that growing legacy of resistance taught and shared, Samuel Morrison, who had been the shadow shooter, who had tried to be just a farmer's son, found something his father had died believing in, not just the power to fight corruption, but the wisdom to teach others to recognize and resist it. Not just justice imposed, but justice understood and chosen. The future of the territories would be decided not by guns alone, but by the courage of those who learned to stand together against corruption in all its forms. San Francisco rose before them like a city from a dream, all grand buildings and bustling streets, so different from the frontier territories they'd left behind. The Western Territories Development Corporation's headquarters dominated the financial district, its marble facade gleaming with promises of progress and prosperity. But Samuel, watching from their rented offices across the street, saw beyond. The polished surface, 5 days of careful observation, had revealed the truth beneath the corporation's respectable veneer. Another private meeting, Grace reported, lowering her opera glasses. Third one today. Henderson's been bringing in stockholders, one at a time, hours before the official gathering. Michael, who had spent the morning reviewing documents they'd acquired, looked up from his work. They're offering individual deals, special considerations, preferred stock options, buying silence before we can present our evidence. Smart, Marcus admitted from his position near the window. Make everyone complicit before the truth comes out. Hard to expose corruption when you've already profited from it. But Samuel saw something his brother had missed. Every person entering the building carried tension in their shoulders, fear in their movements. These weren't willing conspirators. They were victims being further ensnared. They're not just buying silence, he realized. They're creating witnesses against themselves. Every person they pressure now becomes evidence of their methods. Marshal Hayes arrived with fresh intelligence gathered from the city's law enforcement. Local banks are calling in loans, pressing businesses that might support us. They're isolating potential allies before we can reach them. Not just here, Thomas Taylor added, bringing reports from his merchant contacts. Similar pressures being applied back in the territories. Every business, every landowner who might speak against them is facing sudden financial scrutiny. The Reverend, who had been quietly observing the corporation's building, spoke with careful consideration. They've adapted well. No guns, no badges, no obvious threats. Just the quiet pressure of economics and social standing. Samuel watched another nervous stockholder enter the building, noting how the man glanced around like someone approaching a predator's den. The shadow shooter's instincts recognized prey behavior, even if the hunters wore business suits instead of gun belts. We adapt too, he said quietly. Grace? His sister smiled, understanding immediately. Already done. The store's records aren't just evidence of their methods. They're proof that resistance is possible. Every person they pressure here has counterparts back home who've learned to stand against them. More than that, Michael added. We've been making our own contacts, small banks willing to extend alternative loans, merchants offering fair contracts, even railroad engineers who've documented how route changes are used for manipulation. Maria's telegraph key clicked rapidly in their temporary office, bringing news from their network back in the territories. Every pressure applied in San Francisco was being met with support and alternatives back home. Like ripples in a pond, Chief Running Fox's representative observed. They push here, we push back there. They threaten one, we support many. Samuel studied the growing evidence of their enemies' methods. The conspiracy had evolved, becoming more sophisticated, more legitimate in its operations. But in doing so, they'd created new vulnerabilities. They want to make corruption normal, he said thoughtfully, make it seem like the only way to survive. But every person they pressure this way becomes proof of their true nature. A commotion outside drew their attention. A well-dressed man hurried from the corporation's building, his face pale with barely controlled emotion. Samuel recognized him as James Carlton, son of the judge who died investigating land fraud. "Follow him," he instructed Marcus. "Carefully. Man looking like that, carrying that much anger. He needs friends more than surveillance." The next hours brought more revelations. Carlton wasn't the only one leaving Henderson's private meetings with barely suppressed rage. Each pressure session meant to ensure silence, instead created potential allies. Grace and Michael worked tirelessly, making contacts, sharing evidence, showing others how to recognize and resist the corporation's methods. The store's records became a manual for fighting economic warfare, proving that even the most sophisticated corruption could be exposed and opposed. "They've made a mistake," the Reverend observed, watching another angry stockholder exit the building. "In trying to appear legitimate, they've had to create official records. Everything they do now leaves a paper trail." Samuel nodded, seeing the pattern. The conspiracy had adapted, moving from violent intimidation to financial manipulation. But this new method required documentation, contracts, official proceedings that could be examined and exposed. "Father saw this coming," he said quietly. In his journal, notes about how frontier justice would need to evolve, how fighting corruption would require more than just guns and badges. A messenger arrived from Thomas Taylor's network, bringing crucial information. The corporation's legitimate business dealings were deeply intertwined with their corrupt practices. Exposing one would reveal the other. "They've built their legitimate empire on a foundation of corruption," Marcus reported, returning from his surveillance. Carlton confirmed it. "Every legal contract, every official deal depends on hidden fraud to function." Samuel watched the sun begin its descent behind San Francisco's buildings, casting long shadows across the financial district. Tomorrow's stockholder meeting wouldn't be fought with guns or physical confrontation. The weapons would be evidence, and testimony, courage, and truth. "They think making corruption look legitimate will protect them," he said finally, "but they've forgotten something important." "What's that?" Grace asked, though her smile suggested she already knew. "Evil depends on good people accepting it as normal, on making resistance seem futile." Samuel turned from the window, facing his gathered allies. "But every person they pressure, every victim they try to silence, becomes proof that resistance is possible." The evening brought more supporters. Bankers who'd discovered fraud in their institutions, railroad workers who'd witnessed route manipulation, merchants who'd faced economic pressure. Each carried pieces of evidence, parts of a larger pattern, of corruption disguised as progress. "Tomorrow," Samuel instructed, "we don't just expose their methods. We show everyone in that meeting that they're not alone, that resistance isn't futile." Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right? On your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.